let's start right at the beginning. My name is Edwin Cleophas. I am the Managing Director of the Social Justice Agency. And our guest tonight is Esther A, and she is the author of this amazing book, Emotional Justice, which we are talking about tonight. And also, we will be launching the book in South Africa in this coming July. So we are very excited about that. We have a couple of good big names coming on board to be partners with us in that process. But we thought it would be very important just to give everybody a taste of who this author is, who this person behind this book is. And I think it's an amazing opportunity to speak to somebody that I met a couple of months ago when we did another online global conversation against white supremacy. So I fell in love with Esther and who she is, and I think everybody else needs to get a little bit of Esther in their lives, just to help them to get through some of the things we're dealing with in our country and globally um, in our world. So, without further ado, Esther, please tell the people, who is Esther A.
So thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to join you on these two corners of the continent, on the west, where I am in Accra in Ghana, and for you in Cape Town in South Africa. So Esther A, three brief words describe me: global Black chick. And by that, I mean I'm a Black woman who was born in London and worked and went to school and lived there for 10 years, then moved to New York and lived there for almost 8 years, and then moved to Ghana and has been here for almost 7 years. And those three cities are really the lens through which I see the world and I do this work. Global Blackness, that's my frame, that's my focus. And so I self-describe as a global Black chick. My family is Ghanaian. My father navigated the turbulent terrain of activist pre-independence Ghana, and then went on to work with our first president, President Kwame Nkrumah. So I am a child of the movement as well as a daughter of the diaspora. And my family got caught up in the military coups of Ghana, and that really shaped what I do. I'm a storyteller. I'm the CEO of an organization, a global institute that does this work called Emotional Justice, a racial healing roadmap that is implemented globally. And I'm a storyteller, I'm a playwright, I'm a journalist, I'm a CEO, but fundamentally I'm a global Black chick.
Awesome. That sounds like something important to get to know a little bit better. But I think at the heart of it all, it just speaks to you being more than just a career woman. And there's so much more, so many layers that we can get to learn and know about a little bit more. But I guess tonight is not the time for that. I would like to understand, right? We're just going to jump in because I've got all these questions that I need to get through. First and foremost, why emotional justice?
Important question. I was on assignment in Ghana on the 40-year anniversary of independence. And I heard my beautiful dad, God rest his soul, tell the story of what happened during the military coup. It is a history that I knew, February 1966, the year that ended the presidential time of Kwame Nkrumah. It's a story that I knew, so I wasn't really paying attention and listening. What was pivotal about that moment is I learned for the first time that although my dad had always told me the history, it was my mother who was actually in the house the night the tanks came, rolled up to our front door as they did others, broke down the door, soldiers broke in battle fatigues and rage in the midst of what was the military coup, broke every window, broke all the cupboards, put a gun to my mother's head. Somehow she managed to get herself and my sisters, her daughters, out of the house, and we ended up under house arrest for almost 2 years before being kicked out of the country and ending up in London. The importance of that story was that the military coup of February 66 is a date in Ghana's history that's always told as the end of a presidential era, that being Kwame Nkrumah. What I learned through my mother's breaking a silence of a story that she hadn't told in almost 30 years, is what changes when you listen to the voices of women and how they have experienced a history that is much more than a date, a note in a history book, and the end of a presidential campaign. So I had been somebody who had suffered from night terrors for years and years and years, more than 20 years. And what I learned when my mother told me the story of what happened the night the tanks came is that whilst I have no memory of the coup or of what happened or of house arrest, my body held the memory, and it kept regurgitating it, resurrecting it when I had these terrible nightmares. And when my mother told the story of what happened, I realized that my body had retained the memory of that night, even though I didn't have a conscious memory. And so it made me think about, who do we exclude when we are telling our history? And how does the exclusion of those voices, how might it change and shape what we think about when we think about our history? And so that began a journey that started in Ghana. I would then go to Philadelphia and report on the Million Woman March and meet the late, great Winnie Mandela, who I spoke to about my father's experience and my mother specifically breaking her silence. And she was the one who guided me and spoke to me specifically about the importance of listening to the women of South Africa, because I was on my way to South Africa after Philadelphia. I would then get to South Africa and listen to and engage with women talking about their experience of apartheid. I would listen to Nchiki Biko, the widow of Steve Biko, and others. And the experience of those helped me understand that even when it came to the notion of justice, there is an emotional life to that justice, that we were dealing with a legacy of untreated trauma. And that legacy was the result of this oppressive system. And we needed a healing for the emotional way that we had all been shaped as a result of the cancer of white supremacy. So that's really the why of it.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot, eh? And taking it all in, I can see why you had to put this on paper, because it definitely, as the one who has read the book, I literally felt that emotion when I was reading it, and hearing it from you just sounds so deep and so real, because it's an experience that obviously you had to go through.
Right.
I think it's important for us to also explain, just for a minute, for people not understanding, why and what does this book basically offer readers when they step into the life of Esther A, and understanding what emotional justice as a book offers them.
So yeah, so this is the book, Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing. What it offers them is a racial healing roadmap that centers global Blackness. And by that, I mean, we have been dealing and speaking about issues of racial healing for many, many years. And of course, South Africa is the home of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is considered and lauded and applauded as the racial healing model that the world celebrated and in many ways emulated. Even our modern diversity, equity, inclusion practice is very still rooted and goes back to that. But through the assignments that I went on in Ghana and Philadelphia and South Africa and New York, and through speaking with my mother and Winnie Mandela and listening to the women in South Africa and doing interviews with the men, what I came to understand was that we had created racial healing models that centered whiteness. They centered white anxiety, white economic insecurity. And part of that was the trauma of being shaped by white supremacy, to the extent that all of us, Black, brown, indigenous, white, center whiteness when we think about issues to do with Blackness and race. And for me, that manifests in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So as an example, the years of apartheid were 48 years officially, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission lasted for 9. So just in terms of even the numbers and the math, we did not go through a healing process that had the same length of time as the harmful process of apartheid. So in other words, we are not giving racial healing the weight, the time, the focus, and the resources that it deserves. And we haven't been centering global Blackness. In other words, those who have been harmed by the legislation of Black inferiority in order to justify separation and the kind of poisonous profiting of labor and human resource. And what that's created is what we have today. The Truth and Reconciliation model reaches back and harkens back to the model in Kenya in 1964 with Jomo Kenyatta, who really sidelined the freedom fighters when it came to post-independence Kenya. And this idea is that you sideline those who are harmed in order to center and privilege those who did the harm, has been an element of our racial healing models. Emotional justice is saying very simply, we have to center global Blackness, Blackness in South Africa, Blackness in Ghana, Blackness in Britain, Blackness in America, Blackness in Brazil. We have to center ourselves in a racial healing model and understand that there is emotional work that we have to do because of the particular untreated trauma that we have experienced as a result of these white supremacist models that extracted labor, that shaped how we saw ourselves as global Black people, and that shaped how we see one another. And the absence of healing manifests today in this expectation that whiteness continue to be centered, even though that has been established as the place and the people from which most harm has actually been perpetrated. So to say that we need an emotional justice is to recognize and name that our trauma as a global Black people has been untreated. And there's always this call for people to be more resilient. What emotional justice is saying is that we've got to resource our healing, resource our care, do so intentionally, do so globally, do so nationally.
Oh, wow. You just touched on something that is a theme throughout the book, which is whiteness and the language of whiteness, and how it has basically um, been inflicted through many centuries into the global Black community about how we see ourselves and how basically we see our oppressors and then put them on a pedestal, and then for us as uh, Black bodies then living as the oppressed in this world. So I wanted to ask you, you write about four pillars,
Mm-hmm.
the language of whiteness. You say there are four pillars that underpins that. Speak to me about that.
Yes. So the language of whiteness is this narrative that we're all taught about how the world came to be and our role in it as Black, brown, indigenous, white people. And that narrative says whiteness is the world, whiteness built the world, whiteness saves the world, and whiteness rules the world. And the cancer of that is that if you are taught that whiteness is, rules, builds, and saves the world, then it means that white people are always the leaders and never the learners. They always expect to be everybody's teacher and nobody's student. They have create a relationship to dominion and to superiority that is cancerous, not just for the people about whom they have a false sense of superiority, but for themselves as well, because it's dehumanizing. So these four pillars, there's two sets. The four pillars of the language of whiteness are what we all have to unlearn, and they are emotional patriarchy, racialized emotionality, emotional currency, and emotional economy. And each of them is defined in the book as something we have to unlearn. So just as an example, emotional patriarchy. Emotional patriarchy is a society where everybody's expected to cater to, privilege, prioritize, and center the feelings of white people and centrally white men, no matter the harm that that may do to literally everybody else. And we have literally created entire policies based on white men's insecurities that then turn other people's worlds upside down. But because this narrative dominates in our society, in our nations, it's how policy is created. That's one example. The second example, emotional currency. Emotional currency is where Black, brown women are treated as if they are a currency. So when we think about the economy of money, we think of currencies, whether that's the South Africa rand, the Ghanaian cedi, the American dollar, British sterling. And Black and brown women are treated as currency that either depreciates, goes down, or appreciates, goes up, depending on its service and their service to white society, to all men, and centrally white people. And the cancer of that is it is a profoundly dehumanizing process. It's rooted in a history where women were treated, and Black and brown women specifically, Black women especially, were treated as labor to be extracted, as a receptacle to be taken from, that there was never any reciprocity, there wasn't an acknowledgement of humanity. And that historical legacy that goes back to apartheid, back to enslavement, back to colonialism, manifests in our contemporary society. And part of the reason it continues to manifest is there has been no healing between us as a people. And so when I talk about the intra-racial healing of us as global Blackness, I'm also talking about the emotional work that white people need to do for their interracial healing and the healing between each other that would disabuse them of this false, deadly notion of white superiority and Black inferiority, because that cancerous illusion feeds entire economies and creates the world that we're in right now. So that's just one example. And then we're replacing the narrative of whiteness, the language of whiteness, with the emotional justice love languages. And they are the four of them: intimate reckoning, intimate revolution, resistance negotiation, and revolutionary Black grace. So just to give a couple of examples of what they are, revolutionary Black grace is about the intra-racial healing between Black people, between Black men and Black women, between Black men and Black men, between Black people in South Africa with Black people in Nigeria, or Black people in Ghana, Black people in America, between us as a global Black people. Intimate reckoning is the specific emotional justice love language of white people and centrally white women that is about saying to them, you have specific emotional work to do in order to break up with this connection to power that centers whiteness and leads you to support a white masculinity that is murderous for the progress of any nation and only privileges the narrow self-interest of those white men and creates harm and perpetrates harm against everybody else. So those are some examples.
Wow. You were saying so many good things right there. I was sitting here. You jumped into the love languages. I was going to drop something about that because we all are used and very well acquainted with the idea of five love languages. But
Mm-hmm.
you added the sixth one. And I wanted to get into that. But you also spoke about um, rest, which is one of the key areas where we need to look and focus our minds, especially our trauma infested bodies, minds, and souls. And I think that is a key concept that flows throughout the book that I want you to speak to us a little bit about. And this is wellness, rest, and replenishment. That is
Mm,
some key factors that you speak about. And I think I like that you dealt with all of that, because I think so many Black people are not aware of what we have been dragging around with us. And
right.
therefore, we are in the position where we are almost constantly and almost always literally at the point of burning out or breakdown. So
Right.
please speak to us about that importance of wellness, rest, and replenishment.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's such an important and powerful point. Black people are celebrated for for everything that they have survived, for the absolute toughness of getting through these horrific histories. But what emotional justice is asking, and what is the toll of having survived those histories, worked and continuing to work in movements against ongoing injustice, against racism? What is the toll on your spirit? What is the toll on your body? What is the toll on your mind? What is the toll of your sense of self? And part of what we need in a racial healing roadmap is one that centers and institutionalizes and resources the replenishment, rest, and wellness of Black people, and especially in centrally Black women. Because part of what happens is, because there's a relationship to Blackness and labor for whiteness, and that is one of extraction, right? That essentially Black and brown people do the work, and white people are the recipients of the work that Black and brown people do. So whilst the legislation that made that a physical reality has changed, the emotional relationship to Black people doing labor and white people in receipt of that labor, the emotional connection to Blackness as a place to extract labor hasn't necessarily changed, because there's been no racial healing work. For global Black people, we have internalized our value as solely being connected to a level of productivity that is exhausting, debilitating, depleting, and leaves you at a constant state of not just burnout, but breakdown. And that somehow that is evidence of your value, that you're able to work at back-breaking, soul-aching, heartbreaking levels and be revered and celebrated for that. Part of what emotional justice is advocating is that, one, we have to identify and articulate the toll on who we have become as a Black people, and not just who we are now, but the inheritance that has been passed down, but by those who came before us and fought bravely, lost, fought again, stood up, were beaten down, got up, were beaten down again, were broken, were depleted, that everything that has been passed down generation to generation has had a toll. And whilst I feel each generation has its movement work to do, this generation, I argue, has to really get engaged in a racial healing in order that we are not continuing this cycle of a kind of pace and a kind of work that is exhausting and debilitating, but it is also expected by white society and is internalized by Black and brown and indigenous people. And so it's breaking up with this relationship to work and labor that is debilitating and soul aching, and instead institutionalizing wellness and replenishment and rest. And the reason why emotional justice gives language to that is it says we have to unlearn this productivity that celebrates working at back-breaking levels. And we have to learn what it is to create and include replenishment and rest and wellness in our daily, everyday work, in our cycles, in our projects, in our jobs. And that, again, is about resourced care. That is something that we pay attention to as a community, as a city, as a nation, and as a world.
Well, somebody is saying in the chat that was very powerful, what you just shared there, and I want to concur with that person. Also, want to say if anybody has some questions, you can drop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and then we'll try to get back to that towards the end of our conversation. However, we have so little time that we have to fly through, because this is a teaser and just to give you some of the good stuff. I can't give you all of it, but Esther, quickly, blank pages. There's a couple of them in the book. What was the thought process behind those?
Blank pages? What do you mean? Say more.
There's the bit that it says there's a deliberate blank page. Or was it only in the copy that I received?
Maybe it was only in the copy that you received, because there shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be.
No.
Okay, so that's very funny, because I thought they were deliberate and there was
Oh,
something deep
yeah,
and
Oh, you got a PDF. I think you got a proof.
Yeah, that's the proof copy that I got. So I thought there was something deep and thought through in that, and that's very funny because
No.
it was actually just because of the cycle of printing the book. No worries, we move along swiftly, and it takes us to the TRC. Although you're from Ghana and you've got your legs out here in the West, specifically in New York and London, you also played a role in being part of our transition for democracy in this country. And you had an opportunity to speak to some of our leaders during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And specifically, I picked up on one of the conversations in the book that you had with our beloved fallen hero, Desmond Tutu.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I picked up in that conversation, and I want to bring it out, that you weren't satisfied with the answers that you got from Desmond Tutu. So you basically asked him at some point, why was the TRC so focused on the feelings of white people, and why were we centering the needs of white people when the TRC should have been about restoring justice and healing the trauma of black people that suffered under apartheid. Tell me what that experience was about.
Extraordinary. It was an extraordinary time. I've had the opportunity to go to South Africa multiple times on assignment, but that time was extraordinary. Going to Cape Town, walking into the office of the late great Archbishop Desmond Tutu, being witness to his prayer before the interview began. And so I would say that it was less that I was dissatisfied and more that what he shared with me led me to a very important questioning process about what the TRC would be able to do for the majority of its population, but also how its focus would, in the end, also fail white people. And that I think it's important to note that um, our racial healing models should naturally evolve the way culture evolves, the way tradition evolves, the way anything evolves, to take account of what is necessary now compared to what was created at the time. So at the time the TRC was created, we have a time of incredible turmoil, transition, world-changing events, and the precipice of levels of ongoing unimaginable violence. And so against the backdrop of that, I can contextualize Archbishop Desmond Tutu. What he said to me, which I always remember, was that South Africa will become a mecca for whites, just like Kenya. And that stayed with me because I was so disturbed at the idea of thinking about how a nation on the continent would, there was such a focus on what it would mean for white people. And what it led me to understand was to actually question for myself the extent to which I had been taught, that we had all been taught, to center whiteness and to center white people, and how that centering problematized our own healing, because humanity requires that we have an equity about how we engage racial healing. And this model was very much about prioritizing one group over another. And so it really led to me asking very specific questions about, he referenced Kenya, to research Kenya and Jomo Kenyatta and 1964 and what happened there, and to learn how the freedom fighters were sidelined and the feelings of the British were very much massaged, and how seeing the same thing in contemporary DEI. And what it helped me understand is that for that moment, at that time, the TRC served a very specific purpose. It is not a racial healing model that serves the future of a humanity-centered healing in 2023. We needed to create a model that took account of what had happened, that learned lessons from what the TRC had created, but also recognized that you cannot talk about racial healing and center those who committed harm and imagine that anybody is going to be healed. You just entrench division, and you go from ending a political and a physical apartheid, and you create an emotional apartheid. You create this separation of feelings around race, and that this set of feelings matters more than this set. And when I say feelings, I'm talking about the structural way that trauma then informs how we engage each other, how we exchange with each other. And we needed to evolve that. We needed to build something new. And that's the task and the work that I took on. And so that interview was pivotal to understanding not just what was working, but what would not work for the future and why we needed something different.
Yeah. Well, well, that explains a lot in terms of what I read in the book. But it also speaks to something that I see as a key lack of understanding within our leadership on the continent, and in our country, where we lack the ability to understand what Biko was trying to tell us when he says to us that we need to focus on um, building this blackness and the solidarity in blackness, where black excellence to some extent have to be pushed to the fore and had to be made the key focus for us as black people on the continent as well as in South Africa. And
Right.
instead of following that concept, we went with this idea of centering whiteness. And almost to a large extent, and continuously, we are doing it. We more so focus on making sure that white people are comfortable
Mhm.
and okay, like you touched on it with the DEI, which
Right.
is diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we see going on across the world. It's all about making sure that the comforts of whiteness are kept in place, and that we don't deter them from their own objective, which is to enjoy their privilege and to continuously force their suppression on us, believing that they are superior. So that is another topic with a deep rooted conversation that we have to unpack. Once you land here in South Africa, we'll have enough time to do that. But you spoke to two massive ladies in our country. One
Mm.
was Insiki Biko, who is obviously the wife of our slain hero, Steve Biko. And then you spoke to the mother of our nation, Mama Winnie Mandela. So,
Mm.
obviously, one of the figures that I hold in high regard for what she did for this country. And I think that she was given a raw deal by the leadership that we have in this country.
Right.
So, I think we should always use any opportunity to give her a platform, even uh, um, post the life that she lived. I always try to put her on that pedestal because I think she did phenomenal work for us in the struggle for freedom in this country. So you met both of them, and
Yeah.
tell me about the inspiration of meeting amazing ladies like this and mothers who took care of this nation.
Phenomenal. I actually met Winnie Mandela in Philadelphia because she was the keynote speaker at the Million Woman March. And I always remember um, an unapologetic power and a commitment to a centering of Blackness, which I would later understand would always make her the enemy of a mainstream global media that had learned to center whiteness and revered leaders that did the same thing. And I think for me and emotional justice, Winnie Mandela is such an instrumental teacher in what it means to ask, what do Black people need for a healing that will allow us to become humanized to ourselves and each other first, and then demand that same humanity from the environments in which we are working and living and breathing and contributing to. Winnie Mandela was the one who said to me when I explained to her what I was going to South Africa to do, I got to tell her about my mother breaking her silence. And she said, you know, make sure that you listen to the women of South Africa and what they have been through. and how they think about forgiveness. Because the idea that we all think about it the same way is simply not true. I'm paraphrasing, but this is some of what she shared. But so much more than that, honestly, to just literally be in her physical presence was such an extraordinary inspiration for me. And for her to just have any words of wisdom, there was a connection because my father was one of the leaders in Ghana who advocated for Mkonte Sizwe, the spirit of the nation, to come into Ghana and do their training when South Africa was deciding to take up armed resistance against white supremacist apartheid. And so I had shared the story with her about my dad, and I just found her commitment to the well-being, the brilliance, the power of Blackness to just be almost overwhelming in its power, and it's really instructional. In Chikibiko, it was different. It was really because I met her in South Africa, and one of the things that I was struck by was her commitment to a justice process, even when it was about something that was as emotional as this outpouring of trauma. And it was really through listening to her. Her son, Inkosinati, was with her when I had the chance to meet her. It was through listening to that commitment to a justice process, even when it was so emotional that would begin the journey of me actually naming emotional justice as the racial healing model. And again, watching her on a global stage, and then the testimony she gave, the interviews that she did, where she would end up suing the government, saying that we want justice for our loved ones, and justice before reconciliation. And it was the idea that for Black people, the connection between emotions and justice must be integral. So what I would say is that meeting these amazing women, each of them, my mother in Ghana, Winnie Mandela in Philadelphia, in Chikibiko in South Africa, and then many other Black women that I would meet in New York and other places, really shaped how I would come to think about emotional justice. And then the men of the movement, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, God rest his soul, is an anti-apartheid warrior and giant, as were so many of the other men that I got to meet. And it was realizing through all these meetings that we were a people in need of a healing that was about us. And the person who made me understand that most keenly was Winnie Mandela. To your point about Steve Biko speaking about the importance of centering Black excellence, it really resonated with Kwame Nkrumah's push, Kwame Nkrumah being Ghana's first president, his push for the same thing. So what that reveals is there has been a connection between us and between Black activist leaders, movement leaders, and presidents calling for a centering of Blackness. And for me, it's creating a racial healing model that honors with an emotional process what they had been calling for with a political and economic process.
Yeah. Wow. No, I think these ladies have had a significant role in also being the leaders that stood with the men that at the end of the day also fought for our freedom in this country. And
Yes.
I don't have many stories of being part of these of the lives of these females or these ladies or these powerful leaders. But one so stories, and this is important to state that behind all of these great men that we celebrate, there's always been these ladies behind them that's been supporting them and that been carrying all the burdens that they were suffering under the yoke of apartheid and fighting against the struggle. Specifically, so I was to some extent, and I see it as being given this uh, handover by Mama Leah Tutu, the wife of Desmond Tutu. So we were at this event, and then she got tired of sitting there and listening to everything, and she walked out of the venue. I walked past her, went to go sit with her for a little bit and had a conversation with her. And she said to me, "No, man, we are old now. We have done enough. Now it's you young ones that must take up the pen and just run with this." So I see these women as really phenomenal and amazing, and I think that the contribution that they made can never ever be taken away. but they definitely left enough for us, like you say, to take on the struggle that we have as this generation, to start working on the new concepts that we need to eradicate. Um, while this is all very phenomenal and amazing, and it speaks to a lot of things that warms the heart, there are other parts in the book where we deal with some of the hard issues that we have to speak about. I want to read you an excerpt that I took out, and I want you to respond to this. This work is about white men's emotional relationship to power and race, and white women's role in sustaining that relationship that profits them and punishes them.
Mm.
So that says a lot for me in the role that white men play. But also, I've always been of the opinion, and I think we share this opinion, that white women have to play a much more significant role in undoing white supremacy and the struggle that we have in this fight for justice in terms of racial justice for the black bodies in this world. Yeah, speak to me about that.
Such a crucial part that you read. There has been this illusion too long perpetrated that because white women have to deal with patriarchy, they are not also contributors to sustaining anti-Black injustice and profiting from that sustainability while maximizing a proximity, a closeness to white masculinity and profiting from that. There is no, when it comes to justice, there is no such country as Switzerland. Nobody gets to be neutral when we're dealing with racial healing. And so for white women, it's been this dance of trying to claim and be part of a sisterhood that is global and multiracial and multicultural, but staying very, very close to white masculinity that is deeply problematic when it advocates for a dominion and a subjugation and an exploitation of Black people. And what emotional justice is saying in really direct terms is cut it out. Cut it out, stop playing games, that this is dangerous. These are people's lives that you are playing with, and that white women have always had a choice, and that is to either harness their power in service of justice or weaponize their power against justice and in service of an ongoing whiteness. And part of what the book does is it really challenges, particularly white women progressives, to say that this is a racial healing roadmap that challenges you to become the change you claim, because your ideology, your philosophy advocates for power sharing, for the dismantling of harmful systems. It advocates for those things, but you still retain an emotional connection to power that centers whiteness. That when challenged about the way that centering harms Black folk and privileges white folk, you weaponize your power against whoever is challenging you. And playing that game in multiple ways is deeply problematic, but it needs to be called out for what it is, and that white women have work to do with other white women to stop sustaining and supporting this white masculinity that is poisonous to everybody, and for which they speak about a victimhood because patriarchy is real, but that they also practice anti-Blackness, which is no less real. And so the book is saying white people have specific work to do, white women have particular work to do, and that we need to identify that, name that, articulate that, and then engage them and have them engage each other to actively do that work. And with the institution that I run, the Armah Institute of Emotional Justice, what we do is institutionalize emotional justice within organizations. So in other words, we develop projects and training and thought leadership so folks can actually apply emotional justice in their places of work, education, learning, etc. Because part of what emotional justice says is that white women weaponize intimacy in order to protect position, even as they advocate for justice and community and sisterhood with Black and Brown and Indigenous women. And again, emotional justice is saying, cut it out. We see that that is weaponizing your power, and it must be challenged because people are dying whilst white people are prevaricating about their unwillingness to be challenged about race, even as Black people are literally on the floor trying to catch a breath.
Oh, I like that. I like that. We're not gonna try and find nice words to say. Stop. We're just gonna call it as it is. Cut it out. We tired of your asses doing this thing. And as Alan says, a lot of these white women, the rhetoric that they use, it comes from a point of self-interest rather than truly equality for all. So it's all about taking care and centering themselves. And Charles highlighting again, we should always remember the connection between white supremacy and the economy, because where money flows, the white man is in control, and it continues to surface like that across the world. Now, didn't even, we almost out of time, and we haven't spoken about your work in the US and the UK, which is another massive part of the book. And we do not have time to get into all of that. There's a couple of other things that I really want to touch on, specifically two concepts that I want you to speak to us about before we end this evening is emotional mammies. That's a big one that I want you to speak about. And then I want you to tell us about grind, because I think
Mm.
everybody knows about grind, but I don't know if they ever met the understanding that Esther Amar brings to understanding this idea of grinding.
Yes, yes. Let's start with emotional mammies. So we all know that the mammy is a word that has a historical root in enslavement in the antebellum South. Traditionally, a Black woman, large, Southern, who would take care of white families, white people, and be very happy to take care of their needs, to make sure they're happy, that this was a Black woman who didn't need anything. There was no consideration for the fact that she might be leaving her family to come take care of white people's families. And there was an expectation that no matter what was happening in her life, she would center, privilege, and prioritize the well-being and the happiness of a white family. That was the mammy as identified in historical terms. The emotional mammy is a Black woman of any hue, shape from anywhere in the world who is expected to take care of and privilege and make comfortable the feelings of white people and of all men, no matter the cost and the consequence to her, to her health, to well-being, or to the environment. And part of what emotional justice is saying is that we have created racial healing models that require Black people, and especially Black women, to be the emotional mammies of the world, to take care of people's hurt feelings, hurt egos, bruised bodies, in ways that have always been detrimental, but take no account of the toll of Black women. And what emotional justice is saying, we have to name this as what it is in order to say, this can no longer happen, must no longer happen, and it has to go, it has to stop. So that's being an emotional mammy. It connects directly to grind. So grind is the contemporary equivalent of basically enslaved labor. It's the idea that you're doing the kind of work that just has no end. And as exhausted and as depleted and as burnt out as you are, you simply keep going. And it's the escalation of the work and also the celebration of grind as something to be lauded and applauded, as opposed to what it does for Black folk, which is to absolutely wear us out. And then to create this emotional connection to grind, and what I call the emotional grind, which is we feel valued because of doing that kind of work, and we value ourselves because of that kind of work. That is part of the language of whiteness at work. And so part of emotional justice and racial healing is unlearning this language of whiteness, this narrative that celebrates grind that is killing us, in order to then replace it with an institutionalizing of wellness, rest, and replenishment, which again entails unlearning the language of whiteness and what it taught you about your body as only being valuable as long as it's in service to somebody other than you. That practice, that process, that path must stop. And instead, we're talking about creating a practice of an ongoing practice of institutionalizing your own care, your own wellness, and the wellness of the communities that you are part of, as part of a racial healing and as part of grappling with this legacy of untreated trauma that hangs over all of us as long as these oppressive systems, apartheid, colonialism, enslavement, modern day capitalism, continue to be the drivers that shape how we move and how we engage, even how we love and how we work and how we lead.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. And I like that part of when I read the book, where you speak about grinding, because I think it's such a common concept to link onto, that many of us can relate to, because it was forced on us from generation to generation that the only way for us to be successful and to live good lives is to constantly work until there is no more life left to live and enjoy that type of freedoms. And a very common thing that I've seen amongst our white compatriots, they always have time for rest, wellness, and
Right.
replenishment. And we don't see that as an option, because it was transferred to us that there is no time for resting, because we need to work hard in order to be somebody and something in this world. And it's a concept that underpins white supremacy and this capitalist system that converts us into the capital that ultimately provides for white privilege. So these are powerful and amazing stories that comes from the book, and it speaks to a lot of what we need to know in order to understand why it's important that Esther is coming to South Africa in July, and why we're launching this book
So
in South
excited.
Africa. We're so
Yeah,
excited about that, and we're
so
looking forward
excited.
to Esther coming. Esther, in closing, there is some discussion points that you highlight in the book, which is also helpful for people. It will help for you to get through all of this reading. I see Alan asks about the book. We are currently in the process of trying to get the book into South Africa. Esther, before I give you my last question, how are we able to get our hands on a copy of that right now? Please tell everybody about that.
Yes. So you can get it right now online at Amazon or Random House or Berwick Kohler, but Amazon is the quickest for now. We do expect it to be on sale in South Africa, but that will be later on in the year. But for now, here it is. Go to Amazon. We might be able to even put the link in the chat, actually, so you can click directly on the link. Maybe Kiara can do that for us and put the link into the chat, and people can literally click on it and order it, right now. And then if you're in Cape Town and you come to the event, I'll sign the book for you if you bring it with you. That would be cool.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a brilliant idea. So, last point, last thought, and I think this would be a good way to take us out for the evening. There's a concept that I picked up towards the end of the book, and it speaks towards revolutionary black grace.
Mm.
Mm, tell us about that.
Revolutionary Black grace is the emotional justice love language for Black people globally. It is saying that we have had a very specific trauma due to the systems of oppression, the systems of apartheid, of colonialism, of enslavement, of the legacy of those systems and the manifestations of those systems, the continued injustices as a result of those systems. So within any racial healing model, we need a love language that is so specific to us, to our experience, but also the breadth of Blackness across the continent and all over the diaspora, in order that we can recognize that there's no longer this one individual monolithic Black, that the nature of historical journeys have forever changed us. But that doesn't mean that we need not see each other as global family. But to do that, we need a better understanding of our different Blacknesses, not to judge or to weaponize or to harm, but to say that history took us in all these different directions, but we can engage and see one another and call each other global Black family. And one of the ways that's going to help us do that and do that work is our own love language, which is revolutionary Black grace, is about extending grace to Black people wherever you meet them and whoever they are, that is specifically about the journey of their particular Blackness, and that recognizes that the fight towards any liberation for us as a global Black people has been the result of some kind of resistance and some kind of revolution. And so our grace must be specific to our Black experience and take account of the historical ways we fought for liberation. Hence, a revolutionary Black grace is the emotional justice love language of global Black people. It is for us to love each other more justly, to engage with each other with more compassion, to extend and reserve the best of ourselves for each other, and stop giving away the best of ourselves to others and leaving what is left unresourced and uncared for each other and for ourselves. That's revolutionary Black grace.
And on that note, as perfectly and well said as you did right there, we will conclude this evening by saying that we stand for one Africa, one continent. And we hope that our people will move into this concept of revolutionary Black race so that Black people can once and for all take up our position as the people of the promised land that has always and from the beginning been the first and will be the last on this earth. So, everybody, thank you for coming out. This was amazing. We appreciate all the messages. Yes, we will have the recording, and the recording will be shared in due time. But for now, from us, have a good evening, and we'll see you soon. Save the date. We'll send out some dates about our July a visit when Esther comes to South Africa and visits Cape Town. And all the best to all of you. See you soon. Have a good
Thank you
evening.
so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for
Bye
staying with us.
bye. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Take good care. Don't forget to get the book. Buy the book.